This is what remains, a ghost of sheet metal and rivets, resting in the quiet of a museum storage facility. It is the nose section of a Japanese bomber from the Second World War, the Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies by its reporting name, Betty. In its time, this aircraft was a revolutionary weapon. It was a land-based naval bomber with phenomenal continent-spanning range, designed to project the power of the Japanese Empire far across the vast Pacific. Its crews called it the hamaki, the cigar, for its perfectly cylindrical fuselage. And in the opening months of the war, it proved to be a devastatingly effective battleship killer, a symbol of a new era of naval warfare dominated by air power. But it earned other, more infamous nicknames from its opponents. American pilots called it the one-shot lighter or the flying Zippo. The reason for this dark humor was simple. When hit by enemy fire, the Betty had a terrifying tendency to burst into an inextinguishable fireball. The story of the Mitsubishi G4M is a story of this contradiction. It was a weapon born from a bold and ambitious naval strategy, a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering that achieved its incredible performance through a deadly compromise. It was an aircraft that could kill battleships from 1,000 miles away, yet it couldn't protect its own crew. It was a chariot for the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and it was a coffin that carried him to his death. And in the final surreal days of the war, it was a vehicle that carried the Japanese surrender delegation on its first step toward peace. This is the story of the Betty, Japan's flawed masterpiece of the air. To understand why the Betty was built, we have to look back to a time before aircraft carriers ruled the waves. For decades, the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was dominated by a single, powerful idea, Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle. The concept was simple and deeply ingrained in the Navy's culture. It envisioned a single, cataclysmic naval engagement, a replay of Japan's stunning 1905 victory over the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. Japanese naval strategists assumed their most likely enemy would be the United States. They knew the American industrial base was vastly superior, so a long war of attrition was unwinnable. The only path to victory was to lure the American fleet across the Pacific and annihilate it in one glorious battle. Every element of the Japanese fleet, its battleships, cruiser, and destroyers, was designed and trained for this single purpose. They were built for speed and hitting power, intended to whittle down the approaching American fleet with night torpedo attacks before the main battleship lines clashed at dawn. But in the 1920s and 30s, a new generation of naval officers, many of them aviators, began to challenge this battleship-centric dogma. Men like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto saw the potential of a different kind of weapon, air power. They argued that airplanes, operating from aircraft carriers or from newly acquired island bases in the Pacific, could serve the same purpose as the surface fleet. They could strike the enemy from hundreds of miles away, long before the fleets ever came within sight of each other. This was a radical idea. It suggested that instead of waiting for the enemy to come to them, Japan could use long-range, land-based bombers to proactively seek out and destroy enemy fleets far from home. This offensive strategy required a very specific kind of aircraft. It needed to fly incredible distances, carry a heavy torpedo or a significant bomb load, and do it all without a fighter escort, as no fighter of the era could possibly match its range. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued its formal specification for a new twin-engine attack bomber to do just that. The requirements were daunting. The Navy demanded a top speed of nearly 250 miles per hour and a combat range of 2,300 miles with a torpedo or an astonishing 3,000 miles with a lighter bomb load. For the late 1930s, this was asking for the impossible. The task fell to the Mitsubishi Company and to a design team led by a young engineer named Kiro Hanjo. Hanjo and his team knew that to meet the Navy's extreme range requirement, they would have to make radical choices. Every ounce of weight would matter. Hanjo's previous design was the Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies as a Naval. It was a capable bomber, but to create a successor, he would have to push the boundaries of aircraft design even further. The new design, the G4M, would be centered around two powerful new engines, the Mitsubishi Kasi radials. But powerful engines alone wouldn't be enough. The real key to long range was fuel, and lots of it. Hanjo's team made a fateful decision. Instead of using heavy, self-sealing rubber bladders for fuel tanks, which was becoming standard practice in military aircraft. They designed the main wing spars and skin to be the walls of the tanks themselves. This was called an integral fuel tank design. It saved a tremendous amount of weight and allowed the aircraft to carry over 1,300 gallons of fuel. But it also meant the entire wing structure was, in effect, a giant unarmored gasoline can. A single stray bullet or piece of shrapnel could turn the wing into an inferno. The weight-saving measures didn't stop there. The design included almost no armor plating to protect the 7-man crew. The prevailing thought within the Navy was that the bomber's high speed and long range would be its primary defense. It was meant to strike where the enemy wasn't, or before they could react. Defensive armament was considered secondary. While it carried several machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the tail, the coverage had blind spots, and the gunners were completely exposed with no armor to shield them. This was the bargain Kiro Honjo and Mitsubishi had struck to satisfy the Navy. They delivered an aircraft that met the seemingly impossible performance specifications. It was fast, and its range was unparalleled anywhere in the world. But it was achieved by sacrificing survivability. The design philosophy was purely offensive. The G4M was a delicate glass cannon, built to fly far, strike a single devastating blow, and hopefully return home before the enemy knew what hit them. The first prototype flew in October 1939, and after extensive testing, the Type 1 attack bomber, the Mitsubishi G4M, officially entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service in the summer of 1941. Its crews, proud members of elite naval air groups or Kukutai, began training for the war they all knew was coming. They were confident in their new machine, the finest long-range bomber in the world. They had no idea how soon their aircraft and its deadly compromise would be put to the ultimate test. December 1941. The world is at war. In Southeast Asia, Japanese forces are pushing into Malaya and the Philippines. To counter this advance, Britain dispatches a powerful naval squadron to its fortress base at Singapore. It is called 4C, commanded by Admiral Sir Tom Phillips. Its corps consists of 2 capital ships, the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the veteran battlecruiser HMS Repulse. They are a formidable symbol of British naval might, sent to deter Japanese aggression. But the deterrent fails. On December 8th, hearing of Japanese landings far up the Malayan coast, Admiral Phillips makes a bold decision. He will take his ships north, under the cover of darkness, to surprise and destroy the Japanese invasion fleet. It is a gamble. The planned Royal Air Force fighter cover for his fleet has been withdrawn, deemed unavailable. Force Z is sailing into hostile waters, protected only by its own anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese are waiting. Based in southern Indochina are the elite air groups of the 22nd Air Flotilla. They are equipped with dozens of Mitsubishi G4M Naval bombers, and crucially, the brand-new G4M Betty torpedo bombers. Their crews have trained relentlessly for this exact moment, a chance to prove that land-based aircraft could find and destroy a hostile fleet at sea. When a Japanese submarine spots 4C, the hunt is on. On the night of December 9th, Admiral Phillips, realizing he has lost the element of surprise, turns his force back toward Singapore. But it's too late. At dawn on December 10th, 1941, waves of Japanese bombers take to the air with a single mission: find the British battleships. For hours, the Japanese aircraft searched the vast expanse of the South China Sea. Finally, just after 10 a.m., a scout plane radios a sighting report. The Bettys and Nels, low on fuel but armed with bombs and torpedoes, turn towards the coordinates. At 11:13 a.m., the attack begins. The first wave consists of high-level bombers. The British ship's anti-aircraft guns fill the sky with black puffs of smoke, and the massive vessels maneuver skillfully to avoid the falling ordnance. One bomb strikes the Repulse, but it is not a fatal blow. The first wave withdraws, having caused only minor damage. For a moment, it seems the capital ships might just survive, but the real threat is yet to come. Now, the torpedo bombers descend. Squadrons of G4M Nels and G4M Bettys roar in at sea level, splitting up to attack the 2 ships from multiple directions at once. This is what the G4M was built for. The gunners on the British ships throw up a wall of fire, but the bombers press their attacks with suicidal courage. The Repulse, faster and more agile, dodges a succession of torpedoes, but the attackers are relentless. Then comes a decisive blow. A coordinated pincer attack by the G4M Beatties overwhelms the defenses of the Prince of Wales. At least 2 torpedoes strike the battleship's port side in the worst possible place. The explosions wreck the outer propeller shaft, and the bent shaft, still turning, tears huge gashes into the ship's hull. Seawater floods the engine rooms. The ship loses most of its electrical power, silencing many of its anti-aircraft guns. Most critically, its rudder is jammed. The mighty Prince of Wales is now crippled, steaming in a slow circle, almost defenseless. The Japanese pilots, seeing the battleship's plight, concentrate their attacks. With the Prince of Wales doomed, the bombers turn their full attention to the Repulse. The battlecruiser, which had skillfully avoided so much, is finally overwhelmed by a perfectly executed ambush attack, struck by multiple torpedoes from both sides. Listing heavily, the Repulse capsizes and sinks in a matter of minutes. Not long after, the Prince of Wales follows her to the bottom. Admiral Phillips goes down with his ship. In less than 2 hours, 85 Japanese aircraft, a mix of G4M Beatties and older G3M Nels, had accomplished the unthinkable. They had sunk 2 enemy capital ships in open water, ships that were fully manned and defending themselves. The cost of the Japanese was minimal. Only 3 aircraft were shot down. It was a stunningly one-sided victory. The news sent shockwaves around the world. For the Allies, it was a disaster on the scale of Pearl Harbor. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the ultimate vindication of their naval aviation doctrine. The theories of men like Yamamoto were now proven fact, written in the wreckage on the floor of the South China Sea. The age of the battleship was over. The age of air power had begun. And at the heart of this victory was the Mitsubishi G4M. The Betty, with its incredible range and potent torpedo armament, had performed exactly as its designers intended. It was now, without question, one of the most feared anti-shipping weapons in the world. But the battle had been fought on Japan's terms. The bombers had faced no enemy fighter opposition. The design's critical compromise, its complete lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, had not been tested. That test would come soon enough, in the skies over jungle-choked islands to the south. There, the Betty would face a new kind of enemy, and its crews would learn the terrible price of their aircraft's incredible range. The early months of 1942 were the high tide of the Japanese Empire. The G4M Betty, alongside carrier aircraft, had swept aside Allied naval power in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. From their new, sprawling fortress base at Rabaul on the island of New Britain, Japanese naval air units could strike targets across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The Betty's extreme range was the key to this new strategy. It allowed Japan to control vast swathes of ocean and jungle from a handful of prepared airfields. The plan was to continue the southern advance, cutting the sea lanes between the United States and Australia and isolating the continent from the Allied war effort. One small, obscure island in the Solomons chain became the linchpin of this plan, Guadalcanal. The Japanese began constructing an airfield there, a critical forward base that would allow their bombers, including the G4M, to dominate the skies over the Coral Sea. The Allies knew they had to stop it. On August 7, 1942, the U.S. 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal and seized a nearly complete airfield, renaming it Henderson Field. Suddenly, the strategic situation was reversed. The Japanese were now the ones who had to attack. From Rabaul, the Imperial Navy launched relentless air attacks to dislodge the Marines and destroy Henderson Field. And the workhorse of this campaign was the G4M Betty. Every day, formations of Bettys would make the grueling 1,100-mile round trip to bomb the American positions. At first, they faced little opposition. But on August 20th, 2 squadrons of Marine aircraft arrived at Henderson Field. One squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and crucially, VMF 223, equipped with the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter. The Wildcat was not a world-beating aircraft. It was slower and less maneuverable than the Japanese A-6M0 fighter that escorted the bombers, but it was rugged heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and its pilot was protected by armor plate. The Marine pilots, operating from their beleaguered dirt strip, quickly learned how to deal with the Japanese formations. They developed tactics to avoid the nimble Zeros and concentrate on the big, inviting targets, the bombers. And it was here in the skies over Guadalcanal that the Betty's fatal design flaw was brutally exposed. The American pilots discovered that a short burst of .50 caliber incendiary rounds into the Betty's thick wing roots would produce a spectacular result. The integral-fueled tanks, with no self-sealing lining and no protective armor, would rupture and ignite. The entire wing would erupt in a sheet of flame, and the bomber would fall from the sky, a funeral pyre for its 7-man crew. This is how the Betty earned its grim nicknames: the one-shot lighter, the flying Zippo. For the Marine and Navy pilots defending Guadalcanal, the daily bomber raids became known as turkey shoots. The Bettys were simply unable to absorb any significant punishment. The Japanese crews knew the risks. They called their aircraft the Hamaki, the cigar, but they also reportedly referred to it as the Type 1 lighter. They were brave and highly skilled aviators, but they were flying a flawed machine into a maelstrom of defensive fire. The losses were staggering. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, the Betty squadrons based at Repulse were decimated. Veteran crews who had sunk battleships were wiped out in a matter of weeks. While precise, verified numbers are difficult to establish from the available records. Some reports suggest that certain air groups lost over 75% of their original crews and aircraft during the relentless attacks on Henderson Field. The very quality that made the Betty a strategic asset, its range, now became a curse. The long flight from Naval meant there was no possibility of surprising the defenders. The Marines' primitive radar and a network of coast watchers scattered on islands along the route gave them ample warning. Every day, the Wildcat pilots knew the bombers were coming. They could climb to a superior altitude and wait, conserving precious fuel, before diving down on the approaching Japanese formations at the most opportune moment. Mitsubishi and the naval arsenals tried to address the bomber's vulnerability. Later models of the G4M were fitted with rudimentary fire-extinguishing systems for the fuel tanks, and eventually, self-sealing tanks and more armor were added. But these improvements came at a cost. The added weight reduced the Betty's legendary range and speed, diminishing the very characteristics that made it so valuable in the first place. And for the hundreds of crews lost over the Solomons, these changes came far too late. The Guadalcanal campaign marked the turning point in the Pacific Air War. It bled the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite air groups white. The loss of so many experienced pilots and crews was a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never fully recover. The G4M Betty, once a symbol of Japan's aerial supremacy, had become a symbol of its tragic flaw, a focus on offensive performance at the expense of protection. It was a weapon designed for a short, sharp war, not a grinding war of attrition. By the spring of 1943, the battles for Guadalcanal were over, and the Allies were on the offensive. The Betty was still a key part of the Japanese arsenal, but its reputation was forever tarnished. And soon, one specific G4M Betty would be the target of the most audacious, long-range fighter interception mission in history. The goal was not to bomb an airfield or sink a ship, but to kill one man, the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the very man who had championed the naval air power that the Betty represented, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April 1943, American naval intelligence listening stations across the Pacific intercepted a series of coded Japanese radio messages. For years, cryptanalysts have been working to break the Imperial Japanese Navy's most complex cipher, JN-25. On April 14th, they hit the jackpot. A decrypted message, designated NTF-1 31755, revealed something of immense importance. It was a complete and detailed itinerary for an inspection tour of the Upper Solomon Islands by the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The message laid out everything: the departure time from Rabaul, the exact flight path, the number and type of aircraft involved, and the precise arrival times at each stop. Yamamoto will be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The intelligence was a stunning coup. It presented the United States with an extraordinary opportunity. The chance to kill the man who had masterminded the Pearl Harbor attack and who remained the spiritual and strategic leader of the Japanese Navy. The decision to authorize an assassination mission against a foreign military commander was not taken lightly. The request raced up the chain of command from Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of Pacific Forces, to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox in Washington, D.C. It is reported that President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself gave the final approval on the condition that the intelligence source, the code-breaking effort, was never compromised. The order was sent back down the line. Get Yamamoto. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. The plan was simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in execution. The intercept point was near Bougainville Island, over 400 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. This was far beyond the range of the F-4F Wildcats. Only one American fighter in the entire theater could make the flight, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a unique twin-engine, twin-boom fighter. The P-38 was fast and heavily armed, but its real advantage was its ability to carry large external drop tanks, giving it the phenomenal range needed for the mission. The mission was given to the U.S. Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron. 18 P-38s were assigned. A killer group of 4 planes was designated to attack the bombers, while the other 14 would fly top cover to engage the escorting Zeros. To avoid detection, they would have to fly a long, roundabout route far to the south, maintaining strict radio silence and flying just feet above the waves for over 2 hours. The navigation had to be perfect. The timing had to be exact. There was no room for error. Just after 7 a.m. on April 18, 1943, the 18 P-38s, fitted with their large drop tanks, lifted off from Henderson Field and turned south. The pilots, led by Major John Mitchell, knew only that they were going after a high-value target. As predicted, at 8 a.m., 2 G4M Betty bombers departed Repulse. In the lead bomber, designated 323, sat Admiral Yamamoto. The second bomber, 326, carried as Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Mato Magaki. 6 Zeros took up their escort positions. For more than 2 hours, the American pilots flew their grueling, wave-hopping course. At 9:34 a.m., exactly on schedule, and just as Major Mitchell's calculations had predicted, the targets were spotted against the green backdrop of Bougainville. The P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks. The cover flight climbed to engage the Zeros, while 4 designated killer pilots, Captain Thomas Lanphier, Lieutenant Rex Barber, and 2 wingmen, pushed their throttles forward and dove towards the 2 Betty bombers. What happened in the next few moments has been the subject of intense controversy ever since. Captain Lanphier, leading the attack, claimed he turned sharply and fired a long burst at the lead Betty, Yamamoto's plane. He reported seeing its right engine and wing erupt in flames before it snapped off, sending the bomber into an uncontrollable spiral toward the jungle below. He immediately broadcast, "I got Yamamoto," but another pilot, Rex Barber, told a different story. He claimed that he was the one who came up from behind and below the lead Betty, firing a long burst from his 4.50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon directly into its fuselage and left engine. Barber reported seeing the bomber shudder, trail heavy black smoke, and then lurch violently to the left before plunging towards the trees. While Lanphier was initially awarded the official credit, decades of analysis, including testimony from the sole surviving Japanese Zero pilot, have led the Air Force to now credit both pilots with the kill. Many historians believe Barber's attack was the one that brought the bomber down. As Yamamoto's bomber fell, the other P-38s, including Barber, went after the second G4M, riddled with bullets. It too caught fire and crashed into the sea. Vice Admiral Agaki miraculously survived the crash, one of the few survivors from the 2 planes. The next day, a Japanese search party hacked its way through the dense jungle to the crash site of Bomber 323. They found the wreckage and nearby the body of Admiral Yamamoto, thrown clear of the plane, his hand still gripping the hilt of his katana. The news of his death, which Japan did not admit for over a month, was a crushing blow to military and civilian morale. For the Allies, it was a major strategic and psychological victory, celebrated across the United States. Operation Vengeance was a triumph of intelligence, technology, and piloting skill, but it was also the ultimate, tragic illustration of the G4M Betty's inherent weakness. The very aircraft that Yamamoto had championed as the future of naval warfare had become his coffin. The one-shot lighter had claimed its most famous victim, and as the war entered its final, desperate phases, the Betty would be called upon to serve in an even more desperate role. By 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Japan. The grinding campaigns in the Solomons and New Guinea, followed by the disastrous carrier battles of the Philippine Sea, had shattered the Imperial Navy's air power. The experienced pilots who had executed the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Prince of Wales were nearly all gone. Faced with overwhelming Allied industrial might and rapidly advancing forces, Japanese military leaders grew increasingly desperate. They began to turn to a new, terrifying tactic: organized suicide attacks. These special attacks, or TACO, were seen as a way to trade one man and one machine for a high-value enemy warship. While the most famous of these were the kamikaze aircraft, the Navy developed an even more specialized weapon. It was the Yokosuka MXY-7, a purpose-built, rocket-powered flying bomb. It was essentially a cruise missile with a human pilot. The pilot's job was to guide the craft, packed with over 2,600 pounds of high explosive, into the side of an enemy ship. The Americans who faced it gave it a different name: the Baka bomb. Baka is the Japanese word for fool or idiot. This weapon, officially named the Oka, or cherry blossom, could not take off on its own. It needed a mothership to carry it within range of the enemy fleet. For this task, the Navy once again turned to the G4M Betty. A special variant, the G4M2E Model 24J, was developed. The bomb bay doors were removed and special shackles were fitted to carry the heavy Oka semi-recessed into the fuselage. The Betty had the range and the lifting power to get the job done. The Betty-Oka combination was first deployed in force during the invasion of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. The operational theory was simple. A formation of Bettys would approach the American fleet, get as close as possible, and release their Oka bombs. Once released, the Oka pilot would glide for a time before igniting his 3 solid-fuel rocket motors, accelerating to incredible speeds of over 600 miles per hour in his final dive toward the target. In practice, the tactic was a catastrophic failure. The Betty, already vulnerable, was now burdened with the immense weight of the Oka. It was slow, unmaneuverable, and had to fly a steady, predictable course on its final approach to the release point. The American Navy, alerted by radar, had established combat air patrols far out from their carriers. Hordes of F-6F Hellcat fighters would intercept the lumbering Betty motherships long before they ever got close enough to release their deadly cargo. The results were a massacre. Entire formations of G4MS were shot down, taking the Oka pilots with them. The Betty's old nickname, the Flying Lighter, returned with vengeance. The slow, heavy bombers were little more than flying targets for the swarms of American fighters. While a few Oka attacks did get through, and one managed to sink a destroyer, the program was a dismal failure. The cost in highly trained Betty crews and volunteer Oka pilots was immense, for almost no strategic gain. It was a desperate, wasteful tactic, born from a hopeless situation. By August 1945, Japan was defeated. The atomic bombs had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a historic radio broadcast. But the formalities of surrender still had to be arranged. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, ordered the Japanese to send a delegation to meet his staff on the island of Ie Shima, near Okinawa, to receive instructions for the formal ceremony. The Japanese needed a long-range aircraft to make the flight. In a moment of profound historical irony, the aircraft chosen was a G4M Betty. 2 G4M1 bombers were hastily prepared for this final, unexpected mission. Following Allied instructions, all armament was removed from the bombers. They were painted stark white, and large green crosses were applied to the wings and fuselage in place of the red Hanomar national insignia. On August 19, 1945, the 2 Green Cross Bettys, carrying the 16-member surrender delegation, took off from Kisarazu near Tokyo. They were given the Allied call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. They flew south, the ruins of their nation, towards the island where so many of their comrades had fallen. It was a poignant final flight for an aircraft that had been conceived for long-range destruction, from the sinking of great battleships to the desperate Oka attacks. Upon landing at IE Shima, the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 transport for the onward journey to Manila to meet MacArthur. The two Bettys remained on the airfield, silent symbols of a finished war. The G4M's operational career was over. It had begun with a stunning victory that heralded a new age of warfare, and it ended with a quiet flight to facilitate a surrender. The story of the Flying Cigar was a perfect mirror of the empire it served, a brilliant, ambitious beginning and a final, devastating end. And so we return to where we began, to this quiet survivor, a fragment of a story written in aluminum and steel. Of the nearly 2,500 Mitsubishi G4M bombers built during the war, only a handful of major components like this one remain. This specific artifact is the nose section of a G4M3 Model 34, a late-war version of the Betty. It was discovered on the island of Saipan after the American invasion in 1944 and brought to the United States for technical evaluation. The Model 34 was Mitsubishi's attempt to finally correct the deadly flaws of the original design. It featured redesigned wings with self-sealing fuel tanks and added armor to protect the crew. It was a better, safer aircraft, but it came too late. By the time it entered production, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing, and its veteran air crews were gone. The fundamental compromise made by Kiro Honjo years earlier, sacrificing protection for extreme range, had sealed the Betty's fate. The legacy of the G4M is one of profound contradiction. It was a brilliant piece of aeronautical engineering, a weapon perfectly tailored to the audacious naval strategy of the empire it served. It achieved one of the greatest feats in the history of air power, sinking battleships on the high seas. Yet, it was also a death trap, a flying lighter that earned a grim reputation for incinerating its own crews. It was a chosen transport of the Navy's greatest admiral, and it became his coffin in a mission of vengeance made possible by its own predictability. The story of the Betty is a reminder that a weapon of war is more than just a machine. It is the physical embodiment of a nation's strategy, its industrial capacity, and its willingness to weigh performance against the lives of its people. In the G4M, Japan created a flawed masterpiece, an aircraft that perfectly expressed its bold ambition to dominate the Pacific, and just as perfectly expressed the tragic, fiery consequences of the compromises made to achieve it.